Everyone, it's Joe and Andrea, and not seen but heard are Chad and Drew. Good morning, gentlemen. Good morning, Andrea. Well, afternoon for Andrea. You're calling us from Italy?
That's correct. Yes, I have a view of the Mediterranean right here. I'm lucky enough to sit this quarantine out in Italy.
Well, actually, before we start, tell us what the experience has been like in Italy.
It's, everybody's asking me, especially from the United States, and whether we want to go back to the US. And to be honest, I feel very, very safe here. They've been extremely strict with the lockdown. So for 8 weeks, we have not been allowed to leave our house unless you go to the nearest grocery store by yourself or go to the pharmacy or to work. But almost nobody's working. And so it's really like it's a very, very strict quarantine, and so it feels much safer. So that has been going on for 8 weeks. They have just started we're entering phase 2, and you can tell already that people are not abiding by the rules.
Oh, it's already I was expecting you to say something else. I was expecting you to say that we heard it was bad, and so we're coming back very cautiously, and you're saying, hey, Drew.
They are coming back very cautiously. The problem is that people are not abiding by the rules that, the gradual, I think after 8 weeks and being Italian as they are, they just can't not see their families, or they can't stay, the 6 feet away from each other. So it'll be interesting to see if they end up restricting again access to the outside because of that, or it's just the way to go and see what happens.
I find this topic really fascinating. I hope to have an ethicist join us in a week or two, because this life versus economy is, I'm just not smart enough to figure that out. I don't know the answer, and if anyone on the line has a thought on it, I welcome it in the comments. Drew is a 10X alumnus. Hello, Drew. And I had a chance to get to know him rather well last year when we were allowed to meet in groups of 200. How are you? And tell us a little bit about today's topic, IP implications to open source projects.
Thanks, Joe, and hello, everybody. I'm happy to be here with all of you. My name is Drew Hillier. I'm an intellectual property attorney. Most of my practice involves litigating patent disputes, and a big part of that does involve litigating patent licenses. So I'm excited about today's topic, which is really about the intersection of COVID-19, open source projects, and intellectual property. And today we're going to talk about some pitfalls, some strategies, some items you might like to know about if you don't already, or if you do, we'll talk about them in more depth, about how you can approach an open source project directed at COVID-19.
Let me ask, before, I know you have some slides perhaps to help us question your points. Once something is open source, like I'm most familiar with Medtronic saying, hey, everybody, here's the blueprint to my old ventilator, go make something. If they're going to make that, is the patent invalid? And frankly, as I understand it, because it's such an old model, anyone who's in the ventilator business really has no interest in making, 3 years ago's product. Chad has joined us with his face.
Yeah, so Joe, that's a great question. I mean, if a company has devoted its patent to the public through a pledge or an open license, that means you can practice that patent, but it doesn't mean that the whole world is open to you, and that if you create that device, that you aren't going to be infringing somebody else's patent. So it's not as if just because you have the Medtronic's okay, or Intel's okay, or somebody else's okay, that you can hit the ground running without thinking it through further.
Okay, well, I know law is hard, and that's why you get paid a lot of money, and why I sit here most days with a dog in my lap.
I have a little slide that shows that if I can show it.
Okay, I'll give you that in just a moment, but let's hear from Chad. Fresh-faced, obviously very showered in a fresh shirt. And so I understand you're the head of the practice there. Please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks everyone. And I apologize for the technical difficulties I had getting in. Anyways, as Joe mentioned, so I chair our IP and FDA practice group, focus a lot of time, basically all my time in the life sciences industry, both from an IP and an FDA perspective. And the topic today, talking about open source issues, it's obviously been in the news lately. We've got a lot of companies who are promising to participate at that level. It's an incredibly interesting issue on the life sciences side, from medical devices to pharmaceuticals to diagnostics. It's not an area where open source has really been a topic. I mean, and really life sciences has been driven by having your own patents, enforcing those patents, and the exclusivity that they give you in terms of promoting innovation. So it's really interesting as we see dealing with this pandemic. Both interesting seeing some companies stepping up and offering open source technology, although a lot of those companies have kind of been traditionally some of those tech companies who are in that space. But also will be interesting to see if this expands out, especially as we start getting vaccines, therapeutics. Obviously, we have some diagnostics now, but when we get some approved vaccines and therapeutics, how these issues kind of trickle down. But it's definitely an interesting area.
Okay, I will give the screen to whomever raises his or her hand first. Go.
Yeah.
Okay, Andrea, it is. Thank presenter.
All right, so I can't see what it is that you are seeing.
We can see the big slide and the 5 to the left.
Perfect. So this is why it's sort of a representation of why just because you have a patent, it doesn't mean that you can just go ahead and practice what that patent claims, like Drew said before. And a lot of people are expecting that when you get that patent, like in the figure in the left, the patent office will sort of give you that plot of land, right? And then say, okay, this is what we give you. This is your plot of land. You can do whatever you want on it. And that's not really the reality, because what happens is the patent office they're only supposed to give you a patent if there isn't prior art on it, right? If there aren't any other patents or patent applications, publications that disclose what you're trying to claim, they only spend very little searching for prior art. And so they do a little bit of a search. They say they haven't found anything, and so they give you your plot of land. But in reality, there will be oftentimes overlapping plots of land. And so those are the ones that you have to be very careful about. And that's why you can't just assume that because you have a patent on something, it means that you're free to operate and manufacture or use that.
I'm a visual person. This plot of land concept is intriguing to me, but I don't quite get how you're building your house on top of my house.
Yeah, I mean that's just how the patent system works, because they are not really out there measuring and seeing what other people have plotted, unfortunately, too thoroughly.
So is the concept here that reality is the patent offices throughout the world, I guess, are not artificially intelligent enough or resourced enough to do a search so complete as to guarantee that this is your plot of land? Is that the
yes? I think a lot of times it is a resource problem. When, for example, when I do a freedom to operate type of search, which tries to figure out what plot of land you're allowed to use by looking at what are the plots of lands around it, it takes about 40 hours of work. patent examiners usually get anywhere from, I mean, what they get and what they usually search anywhere from half an hour, sometimes 20 minutes to sometimes 2 or 3 hours. And maybe Drew and Chad can shed more, they probably have more experience with that. Again, when you're trying to invalidate a patent, like Drew and Chad often do, you're spending 40, 60 hours searching for prior art. So it is a resource issue. It is also a skill issue. Patent examiners really aren't trained to search as much. They're more trained on writing these office actions and using legal language to apply the laws, less so in searching for prior art.
I'm thinking that Drew and Chad are well compensated and have the time and the resources to do a search more thorough than the patent office will. Is this like the equivalent of my private defense attorney and whatever the state will give me?
Yeah, Joe, that's a great analogy. And I think it's also the context in which it comes up, as opposed to, as Andrew was talking about, getting a patent or defending yourself in a multi-million-dollar litigation in which sometimes billions of dollars are at stake at the end of the day. So companies definitely have the resources to put in more efforts. And I think one of the interesting things that both Drew and Andrea hit on here about the overlapping patents is you can get patents on certain aspects, and that's why if you just if a certain patent is put into an open source or is licensed, it doesn't give you the right necessarily to practice everything you want to do. For example, if you have say some sort of auto injector device or something, you can get a patent on say the needle system and how that's set up. Well, somebody else can have some sort of patent on the method of using that, or maybe a patent on some of the electronics that may go behind some of these electronic devices. So if I get through open source the right to use that needle patent, that's great, but can I really go to market then with my auto injector if somebody else's patent on the method of using that hasn't been licensed to me? And I think that's where it gets starts getting fairly complicated, particularly as you're in the space and you're developing that device or whatever it is. So it's important to really pay attention to not only the patents you're getting through the open source, but also what other patents may be out there that may get at the method of use, may get at the different aspect of what you're trying to do.
If you don't mind, my friend Khalid is on the line, and I'm going to offer him the mic. He's presently self-muted if he unmutes himself. He writes, "It's much worse than the resources issue. Many examiners do not work in their areas of expertise, and that's much of the reason I left." So Khalid, if you want to unmute yourself and share an example, you're welcome to. And I have pushed all the buttons I can push. It's up to you now. And let's move on, because that's not happening at the moment. Drew or Chad, do you want the screen?
Yeah, sure. I'll take the screen and run through something, talk about this open COVID pledge and license. That is
How many
new
projects are you aware of right now that are open source?
projects.
That
That
are
I
open
don't.
source having to do with coronavirus?
I'm aware of there's at least 3 initiatives to push out open source licensing so that intellectual property isn't a hurdle to developing COVID-19 products. What I want to see here, do I click show screen?
I have given you the privilege. There we go.
Okay.
By the way, I've never said the name of your firm because there are 3 names and none of them are easy to pronounce. What is the name of your firm?
Our firm is Axon, Veltrop, and Harkrider, but we also just go.
Consider just calling it the Joe Hage Companies or something easier?
Well, we do normally just call ourselves Axon.
Okay.
Okay, so are you able to see this PowerPoint?
I'm able to see a beautiful black screen with your Axon logo.
Oh, okay, how's this?
Now I'm able to see a beautiful screen with your PowerPoint presentation.
Okay, let me just move my camera so I'm not staring at you. Okay, so this COVID pledge and license, this is a system that it's a two-part system that gives access to IP. The first part is that a company decides to join the pledge, and this pledge is to make their IP free of charge. The
Do I have
second
to
part,
identify myself? I'm taking part of the pledge, or do I just start working on stuff and you might not even know?
you can, so this is a pledge to make your IP available to the public. So if you have a patent, Joe, you can make the pledge and create a license and let others use it. So the second part is the license. There's a few different types of licenses. These are limited to patents and copyrights. The first type ends a year after the World Health Organization declares an end to the pandemic. The other type is also for patents and copyrights, and it ends when WHO officially declares an end to the pandemic, or January 1st, 2023. This is for companies who want to have a date certain to the end of their license and don't want it to extend forever at the risk that the World Health Organization never says that the pandemic is over.
Mm-hmm.
There's another version that's like these prior ones with the date certain that ends it, but it's limited to patents only. Now that's a concern.
OCL is open, like
Open COVID pledge.
Oh, open COVID pledge and license. Sorry, and PC
is the I actually don't know what that stands for, but it's how they've given their shorthand to these different licenses.
Patent and copyrights, PC, and
Oh, I think you're right. Yeah.
Ends 1 year. One's on the 2023, limited to patents only.
Yeah. So if you get this one that's limited to patents only, that's if you're in the if you're doing medical devices that have a software component, and so many do, then you run the risk of having a software component that might be, perhaps it's patented and you can use that patent, but then you don't have the freedom to access the copyright. So not only do you have,
if you're able to maximize your screen, that'd be great. If not, we'll continue.
okay, I can do that.
I think it's the one to the left of the slider there. Yeah, that's it. Well, we see your notes as well, so that wasn't much.
Yeah, well, that works. I don't have any notes, so it's fine. But
well, it does take up I think the other way was better. Go ahead and revert, I guess.
So then a final option, and I think we're gonna see more of this, is each company that's made the pledge can tailor its own license for the situation. Intel's done this. And what they've done is create a license that has the date certain, but also makes provisions for prior licenses that might exist between Intel and the company that's using the IP. Now, so again, like I said, a lot of what I do is litigating, and a bulk of that litigation is litigating patent licenses. So I'm thinking about the problems for enforceability and how this is going to play out in court. If you go back to contract basics and licensing basics, you have to have something called consideration. That's a promise for a promise. I promise to do this, you promise to do that, or I promise to do this if you do that. That's not as clearly present in these one-way licenses. There's no requirement on these licenses that you sign it and send it off to the company that's dedicated their IP. So you have some risk going forward about how those companies are going to decide whether to abide by their license grant. Now, this follows, you probably heard of Creative Commons. This follows that type of model, and courts have held that Creative Commons licenses can be enforceable. So we're probably going to see them being enforced, but then what we might see is a fight about whether you've complied with the license. And if you read these licenses, they're very short. They're 5-6 paragraphs, but there's some wiggle room that might cause some problems and some things you might want to think about. One is the scope of it again. It's for the sole purpose of ending the COVID-19 pandemic and minimizing the impact of the disease. So they're not giving away their IP for you to do anything. They want you to use their IP to address the pandemic. But there are some questions about what does it mean to minimize the impact of the disease. If you have a patent directed to a floor cleaning machine, you could use that in a hospital. That could minimize the impact of the disease, but it's not as clearly defined in terms of what they're getting at, which is really treatment, diagnostics, and elimination of the virus. That's one fight you might have. Another fight you might have is about what constitutes the end of the pandemic. What is good enough from the World Health Organization to state that the pandemic is over? Is it an assessment that the numbers and rates of infections are low enough that it can't be considered a pandemic? Is it a proclamation that it's now just in a few different countries, or what could it be? That's something that will be thought about, especially if you pick a license that has the indefinite term that's keyed into the World Health Organization declaration.
Does your firm anticipate a lot of legal activity around this? Or is it, hey, we're all good global citizens, we're all trying to do the right thing, and we're not, I know that almost sounds naive coming out of my mouth, but.
Unfortunately, I think that there's going to be a lot of litigation about whether it's this license in particular, I'm not sure, but there will be a lot of disputes coming out of this. I think that the non-practicing entities are going to come out of the woodwork, especially once things have calmed down.
I'm sorry, the non-practicing entity, what does that mean?
So a non-practicing entity, that's a company that holds patents, they hold other intellectual property.
Use names. Is it Medtronic or the others?
It's not Medtronic. It's
everyone using their patent is a non.
Yeah, so a non-practicing entity. So let's look at Medtronic. Medtronic is not a non-practicing entity. They hold IP, but they also make medical devices. A non-practicing entity is a company that doesn't make anything. What they do is their business model is holding patents and asserting those patents against companies who are making things.
You're talking about I forget what the derogatory term for this is, but
the term is, yeah, patent troll is the non-PC term for a non-practicing entity.
What is the PC term for them?
A non-practicing entity.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
All right, a patent troll holds lots of patents and then starts to chase people and say, hey, that's an infringement, you pay me, you pay me, you pay me.
That's right. And so
model.
That's the business model. And that's what Andrea was talking about or hinting at earlier, the need to do a thorough search so you know what the patent landscape is and you know what you can expect if you decide to go a certain route in development.
So
then the other,
if I may understand, I think you said, so the only one I'm really aware of is Medtronic released its old ventilator model and said, everyone go ahead. So if I take that privilege and I start building on it, if I don't build it identically and I make a little improvement, a patent troll could say, hey, wait a minute, that improvement, that's not part of their thing, that's my thing, and I'm suing you for using it without compensating me.
It's actually even worse. You could do exactly what, hypothetically, you could do exactly what Medtronic says anybody can do. And there might be a patent out there that covers a regulated device that's part of that.
Is this like the reality of Medtronic built their original one on top of someone else's land in the first place?
Exactly. And in that case, you could be liable for patent infringement down the road.
Is the thought that, well, Medtronic is going to crush anyone who tries to patent troll them about that old thing, but I'm a two-person operation and I can't defend myself?
Well, I don't
that's
think
the reality, right? That sometimes big companies might not even need IP. The only reason they might have IP is because there are other big companies like them that can engage them in litigation and have the resources to drag that on for years and years. But yeah.
If you don't mind, because I find this to be very complicated, and that's why you're all well compensated, and I sit here typically with a dog in my lap. Could you use the names of companies. I know it's all hypothetical, but if you could say like Medtronic and then Philips and then Joe Inc. or something like that, so I can get a sense of what we're talking about. So,
Yeah, so one of the most, oh, go ahead, Andrew.
In particular for ventilators, and I actually have a slide for that shows how litigious they are.
There, it's yours again when you're ready to accept the awesome privilege and responsibility.
And they're in particular two ventilator companies that that seem to lead the litigation. So this is just
Have you? There we go. Thank you.
Respiratory devices, and you see that ResMed and Fisher and Paykel, they by far outweigh everybody else when it comes to validity challenges. And usually they fight each other, right? And the reason why they fight each other is because they're direct competitors, and they oftentimes have overlapping IP, and they're working in the same market.
If I may, ResMed, in your example, roughly, it looks as though ResMed has 52 patents and is challenging 37 patents.
No, so they've been involved in 80 some patent litigations, out of which about 50 some are where they are the patent owner, so they're the defendant, and then the rest they are the petitioner, where they are the ones.
They're saying, hey, you're copying me.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, so some of these areas are more litigious than others, and I think Drew and Chad can probably speak more to that. But they're not going to sit on their laurels probably if somebody's or they might not sue anybody while this is going on. But the problem is, even if you're not infringing anybody else's, and the pandemic is declared over, and you have built a product on that IP, you basically will have to stop using it, selling it, manufacturing it that minute, or you're infringing basically on their IP. So I would say it's even more dangerous using open license than trying to come up with something on your own.
And I just before you get through, I just have to say, the reason I appreciate the community so much is sometimes I'm thinking when someone comes to me and they start talking about a startup and they say, what do I need to do first? Well, I'm a marketer, so I say, well, you've got to do marketing first. You've got to understand your customer, the problem, is there a market, all of these kind of, how would you actually sell it, and is your value proposition good enough? You were at the 10X where Joseph Anderson spoke about how quality problems hurt his son for life. And I thought, well, shit, quality, that's where you have to start. Well, my friend Michelle's on the phone, and I can't listen to her without thinking, oh, it's got to be regulatory. And now I'm like, and even if I start doing something, I better make sure that nobody ever, since the beginning of time, has ever done anything like this, or I'm going to be sued. I better check with an IP lawyer. And I think, how does anyone afford to start anything? I mean, and Nick Anderson, God bless him, he's my reimbursement guy and my health economics guy. He says a health economics study starts with a 6-figure amount to see if any value analysis committee is even going to accept your thing. I just am sometimes glad to just be sitting here in my office with a dog on my lap.
It's heartbreaking because it's been heartwarming to see how everybody has been helping out, right? And everybody wants to contribute, and there is, you know, and even listening to your past calls, it's been amazing to see teams of scientists and the automakers and the, you know, aerospace and auto manufacturers. Everybody's trying so hard, the vacuum cleaner companies, but really nobody's going to be able to come up with something because so many resources are needed. And it's almost, I don't know, for me it's heartbreaking to think about the efforts and the hours and the money that is being wasted because ultimately nothing can come out to the market and can be used out of all that.
Drew?
Yeah, well, one of the big business considerations is thinking about, even if you do have one of these licenses, think about what the end game is when the pandemic does come to an end. Because it's interesting that the companies are doing these open pledges, and it is altruistic, but it's also going to help them down the line once these licenses terminate, and once smaller companies have produce things that are on the market, they want to keep having them on the market. It's the pledgeors are going to have a kind of a captive audience to create a future licensing revenue. So that's something you want to think about when you're creating your business model for this. I mean, on that, oh, go ahead, Chad.
Yeah, sorry, Drew. Just to echo what you just said, we've been counseling clients who are, thinking about getting into different areas to help with the crisis, and telling them to think about the long game is really, solid advice that we've been trying to focus on, because it's not just the patent issues, then the regulatory issues. FDA right now for a whole slew of medical devices, diagnostics, even things like hand sanitizers, has issued all these different guidances saying, for now, we're not going to take any enforcement action. We're going to let people come to market. I mean, there's this whole industry of distilleries who have gone into making hand sanitizers to help, hospitals and other medical workers have actually access to hand sanitizers, which is phenomenal. It's, it has been stated already, it's, very heartwarming seeing these companies step up. But at some point, the crisis will be over. What does FDA do with it in the context of our conversation today with the patents? What happens to all these patents? Do you have to take your devices off the market because now the crisis is over? If you have been infringing, somebody are going to be liable for patent infringement damages. Right now, companies are going to, and even I think the patent trolls or the non-practicing entities for a while are going to stand back and let these things keep going to market to help everyone. But at some point, maybe it's a year from now, maybe it's longer, maybe it's shorter, you're going to start seeing patent holders exercise their rights again. And, companies really do need to be mindful of that they don't want to be caught in that trap, either be held liable for all kinds of patent damages or not be able to go to market anymore with their products. And it really is, Joe, to your point earlier, it's a conundrum. It can be a significant business issue for any startup company getting their arms around this. We've worked with numerous companies over the years where they're on the smaller side. They don't have the millions and millions to sink into the patent analysis. And how do you counsel clients in terms of, all right, they're starting up, this could be a really big product, a really helpful therapeutic, a really helpful diagnostic, whatever it is. And it is a conundrum in terms of mirroring the business aspects of what they want to do to the legal aspects to stay out of trouble. And I think what Drew said is really the best advice. Think about the long term here.
I hate to think that there are going to be companies out there who really, to use Andrew's word, are truly being altruistic, maybe even spending money out of their own pocket to make some of this happen, only to be punished in a year with a business crushing, layoff inducing lawsuit that, while you were trying to help people, did you know that blah, 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 blah. And the word unconscionable comes to mind, and hey, there are people trying to sell masks that aren't masks and charging a lot for them. Maybe we'll have next week, we'll just talk about humanity. It may be a big topic. We have a lot of questions beginning to pour in, and before I go to them, I'd love to, and we're not close to the end of the call yet, but I'd like to be able to leave today's call with something a little linear, because right now we're all over the place because this is many tentacled. Is there like a Joe, remember this kind of thing that comes out of this? So we've got a huge problem. Some people saying, I'm doing my part, here's my intellectual property. There are other people saying, I also want to do my part. Is there a lesson that is more defined than just be careful and know that you might get sued by a patent troll when all of this is over? I hope there's something concrete we can give these kind folks that have taken part of their day to share with us today.
I would say coordinate your manufacturing strategy. Have part of it be looking at what the IP situation is. How much do you need to look at that? That's a sliding scale based on your risk tolerance, your resources, how valuable the product is. If your product is just to help and you're not expecting to make a lot of money off of it, it doesn't make sense for you to overinvest in in an extensive search for what the patent landscape is. But
does it make sense to help? Is it just I can just hear my wife saying, Joey, why are you doing this? You're exposing the family to risk. I know you want to help, but can't you help in a less potentially crushing way?
And I think that you can, and it's to have a coordinated approach. So think about talk to somebody about how much digging makes sense for you and take it from there.
Chad? Anything you'd add
Sorry
to
about
that?
No, I mean, I think that's right. And it's having, I guess, and I already said this a little bit, but mirroring your business strategy also with the patent strategy. But you need to be realistic too. There's only so much, money and funds and attention you can give to this, particularly if you're a startup company and you're getting started. And, one thing I guess we haven't really talked too much about here, if you are getting into, your startup, you're getting into some new product line or something, and you have the technical, you're using established technology, it can be that the technology, frankly, is old enough that you don't have to worry about patents. And a lot of this technology really is. And
does a troll care how old something is? No.
Well, patents expire. And sometimes it's actually sometimes surprising, particularly maybe because time flies, or at least that's the way I usually look at it. It's sometimes surprising. We'll be talking to clients and they'll be saying, we just worked up this new product. It's got all this new technology, new ideas, and you start talking to them about aspects of it when you're going to do the patent search or the freedom to operate search. And they're like, oh yeah, well, that aspect, people were doing that for 30 years. And oh yeah, no, people knew about this assay for the last 20 years. So there's a lot of things that really have been dated where the patents are now expired, and you don't need to worry as much about that.
Andrea?
Yeah, I mean, I think what both Drew and Chad said is it depends on how much money you're investing and what's the longevity of your project. If you're truly going to stop as soon as the World Health Organization is likely to say that it's over, then you have nothing to worry about, right? And even if it's not an open source, the public outcry currently is so big and so loud that it's unlikely that anybody would sue. But if it's longer than that, I think there's definitely something that you can't just ignore. And there are ways where you don't necessarily have to spend tens of thousands of dollars. The cool thing about patent information per se is mostly free. So there are resources where you can go and you can try to look up patents on your own. You can try to do a little search on your own. Whether you don't go to the USPTO website, use like lens.org or ISPOSnet. You can hire patent information professionals like myself who are much more affordable, so we can do the search. Oftentimes it's better to do it, talking with an attorney, but sometimes if it's a simple thing, you can just go straight to a patent searcher, they do the search, and you can look at the results and get a sense of it. Ultimately, you shouldn't, unless you're 100% sure, you shouldn't make a decision on your own without talking to an attorney. But those first few steps you can do on your own. You can hire a patent searcher, and we're much cheaper and more affordable than the attorneys. And so there's small steps that you can do in the beginning to kind of sense the risk and figure out, okay, there's a lot of art that's coming back, a lot of patents. Well, I need to talk to an attorney, or there really isn't much. So the risk is
And
much
I'm
lower.
getting a question if you would type in what those two sites are to do research. I think you're an organizer, so you should be able to type that out to everybody. Before I go, what is a building list of questions? Drew and Chad, do you have more slides that would be illustrative, or let's go to the questions?
No, I think we can go to the questions.
I'll tell you, when we scheduled this, I guess I didn't really know where the conversation would go. When I thought about IP considerations, I was thinking about it as, hey, I'm working on something about this, and am I going to be able to profit on it later? But everything this conversation I've heard is, if you dare step into the open source pool, lawyer up, buddy, because you may need to defend yourself. This doesn't sound at all like, hey, open source, this is my end to make some money. It sounds like I might be infringing and in trouble, is what I'm hearing. Is that a fair takeaway?
I think these open source licenses are a great avenue to access intellectual property to avoid infringement in the short term for specific issues. But you can't go in with your eyes closed. So you do need to have a better understanding of what it's going to look like down the road before you rush it.
I'm interpreting that as the risk reward of this in terms of a potential profit for me is decidedly skewed towards risk.
I think each situation is going to be different, so it's hard to generalize.
Chad, do you also think it's hard to generalize?
I do. Although, generally, I think it is good always to be aware of the risk and be aware that, it can be quite risky. I mean, here are the things about working in the space, the life sciences space. It is very patent heavy. I mean, that's what drives innovation, around the world, and particularly drives innovation in the United States. So I think having a mindset always that there's a risk out there that I need to be aware of, I think is a good perspective to have.
I'll read a question in the meanwhile, just as Andrea did. You all have access to type a note to the whole audience. Why don't you go ahead and share your contact information should folks want to follow up with you afterward. Let me see.
I don't know if you guys are aware of the Patents for Partnership initiative that the USPTO released yesterday.
No, what is that?
So they released a website where they're basically putting up some free for yes, I actually have it up here. If I can share my screen and show it to you.
Or you could just type in the URL, just as you did.
Oh, sure, I can do that. Yes, absolutely.
Go ahead.
And basically, it's 100. As of now, there are 157 U.S. patents and applications that are supposedly free to license for anybody who wants that. So it's just another resource for free IP.
Charles asks, am I mistaken in thinking the first step to litigation is cease and desist? If the company complies, then litigation won't continue. Is that correct?
So it often does happen that way, where companies will send out cease and desist letters before they initiate litigation. They don't have to, but even if you do get sued, and you're the recipient of a complaint that's served on you, I mean, there are certainly ways to end the litigation pretty quickly. Coming off the market, agreeing to pay some sort of license fee. It will really depend on the patent holder, how aggressive they want to be. So, I guess the short answer is yes, it often does start with a cease and desist letter, but the longer answer is it doesn't have to.
Robert Isaacson has a few questions. I'm going to open his mic in a moment and just giving him that warning. In the meanwhile, let me read Michelle's comment. Curious to see your take on Dyson, the ventilator, and the patents, given that the EU ended up saying we have plenty of ventilators now. Dyson spent $25 million on the development and it did it in a week. Not so much a question there as do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's happening with a lot of them, not just Dyson, G-Tech, the other vacuum company in the UK. Same thing happened. The Formula One consortium that also probably spent many millions of dollars. Same thing. They came up with something that ultimately cannot be used. I assume a lot of the teams of scientists all over the world who are working are going to be in the same scenario. So I think it's something that it will be common.
By the way, I have a dear friend who is the head of marketing for Cadillac globally, and it's my hope that I can snag a little bit of her time in a future week. So I trust that would be interesting to the folks on the call. And if there are specific questions for her that you want to start lining up, I can relay them to her. Robert, I made your mic live. Do you want to go ahead and share your thoughts and questions?
Sure, thank you. This concerns the open source licensing.
Tell us a
I've
little
not
bit about
read.
you first. Where are you calling in from? What do you do?
Oh, sorry. I'm an IP attorney,
Okay.
like Drew and Chad, based in White Plains, New York. My practice involves everything from litigation to counseling, freedom to operate, kind of the full range of IP services.
I used to
On the
work in
open,
White Plains when it was Kraft General Foods back in '94, for what it's worth. Please proceed.
well, I did work for Philip Morris, if that helps, back before they had e-cigarettes. So my question relates to the open source licensing, and if a company goes on to start doing manufacturing under that and they make an improvement, do they get to own the IP rights coming out of the improvement? Do they have to donate it back to the open source consortium? And what happens after the term when the open source licenses disintegrate?
Yeah, so the licenses that are in the COVID Open Pledge platform, they don't say what the answer is to that. So you're left without knowing. One thing that is clear is, and not for patents but for copyrights, that you would have the right to the derivative work. So if you have a software program that you've taken through the license and you need to make adjustments to it, that you don't have to worry about it being a problem.
Okay. Thank you, Robert. Aaron Peterson, my buddy, I'm going to give you the mic. And you had a question too.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, great. Yeah, my question comes from the other perspective, not from someone who is taking an open source, but somebody who wants to make some IP available for an open source project.
Give us context about what you do.
Oh, sure. I'm the VP of R&D of a startup medical device company focusing on early detection of heart disease. And the reason why this question is important is because many patients are not receiving care right now who have early stage heart disease, and those diseases are progressing because they're not seeking help from the hospitals. They're afraid of getting infected, so the disease is progressing. So at the tail end of COVID, we expect another tsunami of heart disease and other types of patients who are not seeking care. So our technology helps to stratify risk and help triage and get the patients who are needing the care most at the front of the line. So if we wanted to make that technology available in an open source project during the COVID pandemic, what is our risk in terms of not being able to protect our IP going forward? Do we need provisional patents in place before we even make that license available? Or once it's out in the public domain, we've lost our rights to protect it?
Gentlemen?
Aaron, this is Chad. So, I think you do want to be really careful about how you go about doing that. This consortium is certainly a way to go about doing that. provided that the licenses are tailored enough to end at the point in time where, you know, the epidemic ends. And again, Drew raised some really good questions about, you know, when will that actually happen and how will that happen? And, you know, some of these questions are certainly up in the air. I mean, you do have the right just to license people. And you can, you know, and when I say like, you can give licenses for free, so you're not charging any royalty. And that is probably the safest way to protect your IP later on, because you can have provisions both on terminations of those licenses and, you know, basically write into those licenses why you're doing it, that's for a limited purpose and a limited time frame. So that may be one of the best ways to go about it. I do suspect that some of the companies who are participating and donating their patents and IP into the consortium are doing that with the openness that later on they may never pick those patents back up. And if you notice, Drew had a slide up about a lot of the companies and universities who are participating in it. There are a lot of companies that participate in open source anyways, you know, particularly on the tech side of the world. So they are kind of used to this world of, I give my patents up, you know, the kind of the bargain for that is they often then get patents from other people, again, for no charge. So I think for a company like yourself, it's a great question and it's a great thing to be concerned about, because you don't want to be on the other end of this and, you know, have useful IP that, you know, you've worked hard to develop and not being able to enforce it. So kind of circling back to what I said to start it with, I think offering, you know, royalty-free licenses that are very well crafted, I think is important and probably the best and safest way to go about that.
And it wouldn't be considered public domain if I did that before putting patent protections on it?
Oh, well, I'm glad you clarified. So I was assuming when you were saying this, it was with patents that you had already filed or patents that had been issued. If they haven't, if it's technology you're still working on that you haven't yet had the opportunity to go to the patent office, I would suggest that you do that first, because yes, I think you can potentially, I mean, there are ways to protect that, but I think if you let that out into the world, you may lose your ability to patent it one day. So I would suggest that you get the patent applications on file before you go ahead and do that.
And will a provisional patent application satisfy that need?
I mean, it should, although, you know, I'll say that with the usual risk that, you know, often when you go from provisional to non-provisional, you've now been able to come up, or you've come up with more, you know, data details, however you want to say, to add in there. And you would run the risk, again, that you come up with that more information as you've gone from the provisional to the non-provisional. But otherwise, it at least holds your place in line, which is what you're worried about in terms of getting the patent on file. So you've now established your priority date.
Khalid, I
Thank you.
see you're back with a microphone and you say, please tell them to be careful about provisionals. Would you elaborate?
Yeah, so I was an examiner for the Patent and Trademark Office for a while, and actually got out for some of the reasons that everybody's talking about. But be very careful with a provisional, that it has all the support for anything you might want to claim in the future. Because if it doesn't, and even if you do get the patent, they can come back around and you can be challenged. And if there wasn't support for it in the original provisional, you're going to lose that patent. I had a number of patent attorneys that I worked with, and I won't mention any firms, saying that patents weren't worth the paper they were printed on unless you had the money to go ahead and defend them in court. So I just wanted to make sure, be really, really careful about those provisionals.
Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Jeffrey Ives, I've gone ahead and make your mic live. Go ahead.
So I had a very simple question, and it really relates. Oh, I'm sorry. I've been working in IVDs for many years, from R&D through to manufacturing and operations. And thank you for the topic today. My question was really about relates to risk. And I have actually my son works at a local manufacturer. I'm in Colorado. They make skis, by the way. They're very good. But they switched over and have made a few thousand face shields, low tech, nothing, extravagant there. And they're done with that now. It was just to help out a little bit. If there was a risk to them or a similar operation, would that risk financially be limited by the small amount of revenue they earned? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the bottom line is basically yes. For the measure for patent damages can vary, but it's always going to be at least what a reasonable royalty would be for the infringing product. So if they made 1,000 face masks and the reasonable royalty for those is a buck per face mask, then they're on the hook for $1,000, assuming there aren't other issues like willful patent infringement and things like that. So that's the short answer, that there is, as the value of your product goes up, the risk goes up as well.
Joe, you're muted.
Well, that's how come David didn't know that he's not muted. David goes off.
Oh,
Yeah, see, I was trying to have you not hear me typing, but go ahead. You had a question.
okay, you can hear me.
I can.
Good. It had to do with that a patent troll who would take on someone who could wrap themselves in the virtue of addressing the pandemic would have to be a particularly bold and amoral troll, and possibly suffer the kind of extra prosecutorial and legal scrutiny as well as moral outrage of a Martin Shkreli. So I mean, I know lawyers like to a group of 3 lawyers, most problems look like legal problems. Okay, 2 lawyers and okay. And I just wanted to suggest that the risks of an enforcement action, or even an attempted enforcement action, could really blow up in the face of an action against an entity that has some reasonable capacity to market and message.
And that is correct right now. And that's why I said I don't think anybody will sue during the crisis. But once the crisis is over, it will be different. Yeah, and like you said, there's several examples where companies have tried to either enforce or patents, like some of the Chinese institutes have tried to patent remdesivir applications, and the outcry has been very loud. But once this pandemic ends or teeters out, it will be a different scenario.
We're just about at an hour. I want to be faithful for everyone's time, but Rob Supplebean, if you'd introduce yourself, we'll give you the last question today, please. And all I need to do now is hit this button. And you need to do your button.
How about now?
Yep, we're good.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm Rob Supplebean. I design medical devices, mainly prosthetics, so not this space. But my question is, with Medtronic releasing their plans and basically saying the world can use it, wouldn't it be safer to be a 2nd or 3rd tier manufacturer and supply them with equipment? Because the idea of a company making that big of a device right from scratch is a big investment. And this way you could actually become a supplier. And I think there's just a better path for profitability and future.
Yeah, in terms of the business aspect, that definitely could be the case. From the legal aspect, just because you're a 3rd supplier, you're supplying a part within the system, that's not going to necessarily keep you safe. But you would have issues with it's called contributory infringement or induced infringement or just straight up direct infringement, depending on what type of product you're creating.
Joe unmuted himself for the last time. As I shared before, this is, I find at the end of all of these calls, whether it's these COVID calls on Tuesdays or the Friday calls where we talk about everything medical device, I put a link and I've made it available for everyone now, especially in lockdown. I feel we need one another more than ever, if for no other reason than to maintain our sanity. And my wife and kids are really quite eager to get away from me. But that's not something I need to foist onto the world. I apologize. That was a momentary lapse of judgment. Thank you, Andrea, Andrew, and Chad. You've shared your contact information for everyone. Next week's topic, I'm not sure, but it could be my friend from GM. And I welcome your notes on what other topics you'd like to have covered. I'd like to keep these Tuesday calls robust as they were today. So again, thank you. And IP is hard too. Everything is hard about this business, and we get by with a little help from our friends. So on behalf of Joe Hage, I'm Joe Hage. I'll see you next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you,
everyone.